Alright, this is a ACCT302 LESSEE lecture, so you have to get your LESSEE lecture note and follow along. The first examples, 1ABC, are the conceptual nature of a capital lease, and it's just like purchase with financing. We're going to kind of scoot through these, but they'll help you get the idea of a lease transaction and also show what's motivating capital lease accounting under U.S. GAAP. So, like with my other lecture notes, let me scroll a little bit here so you can see example 1. We're going to have a same fact set or same setup, and then we're going to follow that through the lecture note. So Larry's equipment purchases a Bobcat worth $62,548, and right there. Larry's can finance the purchase 10% over 5 years, so they're just going to get a 10% loan. The residual value is $5,000, useful life is 8 years. So we're just going to show the accounting for purchasing the equipment, accruing interest expense, and depreciating it. So this isn't lease accounting, this is just, hey, let's remember what a purchase looks like. So they would recognize equipment worth $548 on the date of purchase. They put $15,000 down right over here, and the balance on day one would be $47,548. Now from that number, you can get an amortization schedule. So I have two 1/114 rows. Your book doesn't do this, but I found it's good to, when we get to leases, you'll see why it's good to separate that out. But if it's a loan on 1/114, we make the $15,000 payment, so the note's only going to have a $47,548 balance. You multiply that times 10% under the effective interest method, and you get $47.55 in interest. The remainder of the $15,000 payment, the $10,245, is subtracted to there, and you have from the original balance, and you have $37,303. So we're just applying the effective interest method as we did with bonds. Oops. All right. So that's how the schedule goes, and we'll see the interest expense is $47.55 here, and here's interest expense. Interest payable on 12/31 of 2014, and the depreciation is $7,194, which was the original balance of the equipment, $62,548 minus the $5,000 residual value divided by the useful life. Okay, so this should be, let me grab a pen here. This should equal $62,548 minus $5,000. You're buying it, so it's not over the time you pay it for it, but rather its useful life of 8 years. All right. Okay. Oops. Having a little trouble with the erase function here, so I don't know why it keeps selecting that. Exciting stuff. Okay, so and the journal entry to record the loan payment on the next day. So these two different journal entries from here to here are just trying to show our accrual accounting, the difference between accruing the interest expense and when we pay for it. So we pay $47.55 in interest, the balance goes to no payable, and we credit our cash $15,000. Now, let's say we have the exact same equipment and we enter into a lease. So they're going to enter in a 5-year lease, and at the end of the lease, then Cougar Construction gets title to the property. All right. Now, where do the payments come from? We're going to get more into this when we get to the lessor, but I do the payment calculation here. essentially so that the lessor gets their money and present value back. But let's set that aside for now. The main thing is that this, from the lessee perspective, is that this 62,548 is equal to the present value of the lease payments. And we're going to see that theme coming back. 62,548 is going to be equal to the present value of the lease payments. If they originally capitalized this amount and on the same day, since this lease is set up as an annuity due, they paid $15,000, then their balance would be of the lease payable would be $47,548, and interest expense would be $4,755. So this looks pretty much like the loan. You have the same payments, you'll have the same interest expense, and at the end you own the property. So it looks like the lease is just a different way to finance it. And in fact, what GAAP makes lessees do who would have a lease like this is recognize interest expense and recognize depreciation expense. And these numbers end up being identical to the purchase, and in this case, it's kind of the extreme case, the item is transferred at the end of the lease. And once again, there's a payment over here, and that looks the same. So that's 1B. Now let's go to 1C. They're going to enter into a 5-year lease, but it does not transfer ownership, and it has none of the other additional features that we mentioned on page 1 of this lecture note. I go through the work of calculating the payment, but let's set it aside and just believe me now, and we'll go over it when we get to lesser accounting. It is $14,255. Essentially what's going on here, it's a little bit lower because they don't end up owning it. That residual value at the end goes to the lessor, so the lessee doesn't pay as much. But we're still going to present value the payment. So you have 5 payments of an annuity due, present valued at, it was 10%, ends up being $59.44. So you don't pay as much, and you also don't capitalize as much. All right, but aside from that, then everything's going to be the same. Interest expense, $45.19. Oh, that looks like an error. Let's check out what this is. So it should have been $59,444. $59,444. Now we're not going to depreciate over the useful life, but instead we're going to depreciate it over the lease terms. The lease term, and I don't have you guys to help me, and my calculator has just disappeared. It has left the building. My calculator has just left the building. Okay, let me see if I can get another one here. Calculator. All right. 59,444 divided by 5 equals, looks like 11,889. All right. Well, okay, I'm going to take a little second to delete all these things. Get these out of here. Okay. Oops. All right, then we have interest payable, lease payable cash, same process as before. But what we're just showing between B and C, it's not always the case that the lease equipment and the lease liability are going to be equal to the fair value of the equipment. Leases are going to only capitalize the risk and benefits, or attempt to capitalize the risks and benefits that the lessee takes on in the lease contract. Okay, so that was the conceptual nature of a lease, and we kind of got ahead of ourselves, because what we really need to do when we do lease accounting is the first thing we have to do is classify. This is step one here. Classify the lease. If it's not a capital lease, we wouldn't do all the stuff we saw in 1B and 1C. So to classify a lease, pretty straightforward. GAAP has a bright line test. Every lease that could potentially be capitalized must be non-cancelable and then meet any one of 4 criteria. And these are set in order so you get the easy ones out of the way and then go to the more difficult ones. So the first question would be, does it transfer ownership at the end of the lease? Does it transfer ownership of the lease? If yes, then it is a capital lease. Does it have a bargain purchase option? So what does that mean? Does it give the lessee the option of buying the equipment at the end of the lease at a price that today is expected to be a bargain? So if the lease said you can buy this $500,000 crane at the end of 5 years, when it's expected to be worth $100,000, we're going to let you buy it for $10,000. That would be a bargain. Okay. Now it may end up being that the crane was worth $10,000 at the end, but when we were standing 5 years ago making the contract, we expected it to be a bargain price. Is the lease term greater than or equal to 75% of the economic life? So if you have a 10-year useful life, if the lease term is 8, then it's a capital lease. And the final one, which is definitely the most difficult one, and once again, if you had 1, 2, or 3, you wouldn't do this. The last one is the most difficult one. It's called the recovery of investment test. All right. But basically what you do is you're going to take the present value of minimum lease payments, which we'll explain in a second. You're going to take this present value and you're going to compare it to 90% of the fair value. If it's greater than the present value of minimum lease payments is greater than 90% of the fair value, then it's a capital lease. The idea from the FASB was that, look, you may not have hit 1, 2, or 3, but if the present value of all these payments associated with the lease are over 90% of the fair value, it must be that in substance you are leasing substantially all of its useful life. Okay? So, the first thing here, and I'm going to mention this several times in the lecture note, this is really, really important. Minimum, whoops, and I'm going to come covering it up there, so that's not very helpful. This term minimum and minimum lease payments. Minimum lease payments is specifically a GAAP term. It tells you which cash flows to present value. If you're going to do a present value, you need a set of cash flows and then you need a discount rate. Well, the set of cash flows under US GAAP is minimum lease payments. They include the lease payment, but from that you have to take out executory costs. So here's component 1. And it's the lease payment less executory costs. Executory costs are things like insurance and taxes. So if you leased a car with a $400 payment and they told you $100 of it was for maintenance and insurance, then the amount you'd put in for the minimum lease payments would be $400 minus the $100 of executory cost, or $300. Okay, a bargain purchase option. So the actual price of the bargain purchase option. So that is, if they said you could buy it for $5,000, then at the end of the timeline you'd put $5,000 there. And once again, you may not have a bargain purchase option, just if you have it. Renewal penalties, if any. So if there are renewal penalties, you capitalize those. And any just guaranteed, only guaranteed. All right, only guaranteed residual value. So let me show it like this. You'd have, let's say you had a 4-year lease. Here's today 1, 2, 3, and 4. And you had a lease payment, I'll just call it LP, which equaled 500. And then you had plus 200 in executory costs. Then you would just have 500, 500, 500, 500, like that. If you had a bargain purchase option, it would be the dollar amount of the option would be here. If you had renewal penalties, it would be like that. And if you had guaranteed residual value, it would be there. So if, okay? All right. So remember, from page 1 of this lecture note, these lease features may or may not be there. They may or may not be there. If they are there, you treat them like lump sums at the end of the lease, at lease maturity. Okay? And then finally, if you are, with respect to this present value of minimum lease payments, the minimum lease payments tells you which cash flows to include. The interest rate you choose, that also has a rule. You choose the lower of the lessee's incremental borrowing rate or the lessor's implicit rate. All right, and then you must know if it's known. So the lessee doesn't always know the lessor's implicit rate. So, but if it's lower and it's known, they use it. And the idea here is that when rates go down, when discount rates go down, the present value goes up. So the FASB is requiring that the larger amount be capitalized. And for the purpose of this test, that the larger amount be used. So I keep referring to this present value minimum lease payments as the amount capitalized, and that's what it's going to be. So even though this number 4 criterion is a pain in the neck, if you calculate this present value of minimum lease payments, you have the amount that's going to be capitalized. So to that extent, at least it's a twofer. If you get that number, you're going to use it again. All right, so moving along. Oh, actually, let's talk about one last detail. So if it's a capital lease, then we're going to capitalize equipment. It's going to be called leased equipment. And we're going to capitalize a liability, call it a lease liability. And then we're going to have interest expense and depreciation expense. Here's one little detail, though. If the fair value of the asset is less than the present value of minimum lease payments, you have to capitalize the fair value. And the idea there is we aren't going to capitalize more than the asset's fair value. That's conservatism, or in some quarters, unbiased accounting. All right, and what is an operating lease? Anything that's not a capital lease is an operating lease. So we're going to do a lot of work to classify something as a capital lease, but if it's not, then it's an operating lease. All right, so the next part we'll cover example 2. And at this point, we're just going to take a little breather. And you'll have to switch to the next video.